Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. In celebration of reaching 4,000 subscribers, I asked y'all last week to send me questions for a special 4K Q&A. And you definitely provided. I've gotten some wonderful questions. Let me start with the amazing MJ of Reading This Life, who asked two questions. First, what is a book that you always over-recommend to people? Well, since I was a preteen, I've told everyone I know, often multiple times, that they absolutely must read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I've come to understand that mature readers, or even anyone who reads the book today, often have big issues with Rochester and with the basic shape of the ending of the book. Or they have issues with the way another important character is treated. I get that. And I suppose if I were able to read the book for the first time today, I might struggle with these issues myself. As it is, my absolute love for the book when I was 12 years old or so has completely stuck with me, even when I want to tell off a character. I certainly think Charlotte Bronte wanted to tell off a character or two herself. Anyway, I recommend Jane Eyre to everyone, and I want to talk about it with everyone. And I'm about to reread it soon for a little class at my bookstore. Slight complication there, but more later. I started talking about Jane Eyre in my very first video, my somewhat embarrassing BookTube newbie tag, and then I continued. In fact, I think almost all of my early videos have at least a nodding reference, maybe even kind of a secret reference to Jane Eyre. My spouse David teased me about it and eventually started keeping a tally of how many times I mentioned the book by name or just by subtle reference on my channel. The kicker is that it took me more than 20 years to convince David to read the book. Luckily, he loved it, or at least he pretended to. And MJ's second question, what is a book that disappointed you this year so far? I was really looking forward to the new biography of Carson McCullers, written by the well-known literary biographer Mary Dearborn. I'm totally fascinated by McCullers, and I very much enjoy her books, although they aren't on my list of very favorite Southern novels. I really loved a book that came out maybe 2 years ago called My Autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jenn Shapland. That title might sound confusing, but it's a hint at what the author is doing, exploring her own development via the life of the writing of the author. It's sort of a flip of what so much of fiction is now, autobiography instead of autofiction. Shapland does a ton of research, actually, and she talks a lot about new sources and new interpretations of McCullers, at least interpretations that were new to me. Dearborn's new biography was supposed to be a more complete work, talking about McCullers much more broadly, but in my opinion, it really didn't. I wrote about Dearborn's book for Open Letters Review. Actually, I think I wrote about both of these books, and I'll leave links down below. I shouldn't talk too much about what I said in the review, but I thought I would mention a couple of disappointments, which I didn't write about in the review. First, I was really frustrated that there was so little documentation available, and that from what I could piece together, it didn't seem to me that Dearborn was being critical at all in her reading of the sources. For example, she uses notes made during psychotherapy near the end of McCullers' life to a psychotherapist who quickly became her lover to give evidence about events from her childhood. Dearborn doesn't even pause to consider that Carson tells her therapist things that might not be exactly how the events happened all those years before. Time alone could have erased things or reconstructed things a little, or the purpose of the telling might have caused her to overstress certain themes, or perhaps she was just trying to seduce the therapist. Also, when Dearborn talks about McCullers' fiction, She responds with straightforward value judgments, like a book was, quote, weak or whatever, instead of trying to use it to help us understand McCullers and her development as a writer, or maybe to help us understand her books themselves in historical context. Anyway, I found the book very disappointing. Well, I went on and on about that, didn't I? On to another question. Mike in Boston asks, is there a book people would be surprised to learn you loved? Well, one is Evelyn Waugh's The Loved One, an absolutely hysterical account of cemeteries and burial and morticians in 1940s California. You may have noticed that I'm not always drawn to sarcasm or even dark humor. I'm not sure I've talked about it much here, but I'm not always a fan of Waugh, to be honest. Brightside Revisited is one of my very favorites, but I'm pretty meh on some of his other beloved books. Also, you may know that death and dying has been part of my life for the last several years, which might make you think I wouldn't want to read a book about death, especially a funny one. But I adore The Loved One. If you haven't looked at it, it's a quick read that left me laughing aloud in a very quiet library. Lisa Garrity asks, which new or new to you authors are you most excited about or impressed by? Ooh. I think the novelist that excites me most right now is Jessmyn Ward, whose Sing, Unburied Sing is one of my favorites from the last few years. Someone on BookTube, maybe Greg at Supposedly Fun, asked who we thought might be an author who would win the Pulitzer Prize more than once. And I named Ward, even though she had not even won it once. Right now, I have her newish novel, Let Us Descend, in my TBR stack, and I'm looking forward to it, although I know several other Ward lovers who wouldn't choose Let Us Descend as their favorite of her novels. I'm also going to name an author I've been familiar with for a long time, but have an increased appreciation for lately, and that's Hermione Lee. With a couple of caveats on my part, I would say her biography of Willa Cather was the best overall bio I read this past December, and I read a whole lot of them. I think the fact that I now often read multiple biographies of the same author back to back in preparation for writing a formal book review has made me really appreciate biographers who do it really well. In fact, right now, I'm on a bit of a slow Edith Wharton kick, and I've never read Lee's biography of Wharton, so that is on my TBR stack too, right next to Jessmyn Ward's book. And how about a short story writer I can't wait to hear from again? A few years ago, I loved Danielle Evans' collection, The Office of Historical Corrections, especially the titular novella at the end. I think I reviewed this book too. Clearly, writing reviews helps me remember what I've read and what I've thought about each of them. I know she has a much older collection of stories out too, and I'd love to see what's coming next. Heidi at the channel My Reading Life asks, what's your favorite nonfiction read of all time? This is a question I can answer. I really love nonfiction, and I have a ton of favorites, from gardening books to academic history. But my very favorite is a book I reviewed on this channel when I was just getting started. The book is called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by the marvelous author Anne Fadiman. Yes, she's the daughter of Clifton Fadiman, whom some of you may know for his work in what I'm going to call the great books community. It's a story about how two communities with very conflicting ways of seeing illness and disability interact. I'll leave a link to my old video, but basically, it's the story of a Hmong girl diagnosed with a serious form of epilepsy and how practitioners of American medicine saw her illness versus how her home community did. This isn't at all a story of one being right and one being wrong. It's a story about how people communicate and how we think about people's right to make decisions for themselves, about issues of consent, about how the world of specialists and non-specialists interact, etc. It's a very thoughtful and nuanced book. And honestly, when I answered MJ's question about over-recommending, if I couldn't have named Jane Eyre, I would have named this one. When David was in medical school, he and I ran across this book independently, and he loved it as well, eventually sharing it with his whole medical school class and his teachers too. Barbara Hellgaker wonders, is there an author you would love to love, but just haven't gotten on with yet? Yes, indeed. Charles Dickens is definitely an author I would love to love, but I haven't started loving him yet. I don't hate his writing in any way, and in fact I very much enjoyed Great Expectations and Bleak House, but love would be much too strong a word. There are sort of two things about Dickens that leave me a bit cold. One is that he often creates these amazing characters that are highly entertaining, but to me often feel so over the top that I tune them out. I know he actually helped create some stereotypical personalities more than he just used pre-existing stereotypes, but I tend to like a deep exploration of more subtle characters who grow over time, like we see in a few of the main characters in Jane Eyre, for example, just to mention that book again as often as I can. And maybe that love of well-drawn, subtle, and developing characters is at the root of my other resistance to Dickens. I rarely read for plot, and Dickens sometimes seems to be relying on plot most heavily. I'm definitely more character-driven, not just memorable characters, but characters who grow and change over the course of the book in ways we, the readers, can clearly understand. Certainly that happens in a lot of Dickens, so I know I'm being a little unfair. To be honest, there is still so much Dickens which I have not read yet. The ones I've not read yet tend to be mostly books he wrote later in his life, all of which seem to be massive. Years ago, before I started a channel, I listened to the phenomenal Katie at Books and Things talk about Dombey and Sons, and about Little Dorrit and Our Mutual Friend, etc., and realized that they sounded so much more like books I might enjoy than, say, Oliver Twist. So Dickens still has plenty of times when he might win me over. But, as I've said many times on this channel, I get really unnerved by mammoth novels. I can read long historical works, but very long fiction? I need to get over this resistance. I was really moved the first time I heard Steve Donahue talk about how he's not a Dickens fan either, and that he keeps trying because so many of the readers he really admires love Dickens, thinking he might finally get it at some point. That's exactly how I feel, although I really haven't given Dickens a fair shot yet. In the phrase I say much too often, it's going on my list. Incidentally, I do love screen adaptations of Dickens, maybe because characters who are very widely drawn, even to the point of caricature, seem to work really well on screen, as does plot. Another question. Joe Spivey writes, my question concerns War and Peace. For those of you who haven't seen Joe Spivey's videos about War and Peace, you really ought to go and check them out. Anyway, he goes on to say, you've said in the past that it didn't stimulate or thrill you on the first reading. Could you elaborate slightly on that disjuncture between yourself and the novel? Well, I just said in my previous answer that big books sometimes unnerve me, and that was certainly going on here too. I suppose I should say first that I read the first two of the big sections 2 years ago or so, at kind of a difficult moment in my family life. I was very preoccupied with my spouse's diagnosis, but also a few other things, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right as I was picking up the most quintessentially Russian novel around. So, at least some of my meh response to Tolstoy's book was really just about my own unrelated situation. I knew that at the time. So when I put the book down, I did not at all think of it as truly DNFing. I knew I would go back to it at some point. After all, most of the readers I most respect here on BookTube adore this novel. And even if they didn't, War and Peace is a crucial novel in Western literature. And to me personally, that fact alone makes it worth reading, and worth reading carefully. Also, I love Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. So I'm still holding out hope that reading War and Peace at the right moment might just solve everything. So anyway, the external stuff almost certainly was the biggest thing standing between me and War and Peace. But my somewhat disappointed response to the book itself might still have been real, I think. The book often felt too much like a soap opera. At first, the episodic sections about life at home, the romances, etc., felt more canned than the battle scenes. Unlike the rest of the world, I think I like the war sections better than the peace sections, especially when we're enmeshed in discussions of mortality or pride or responsibility or hierarchy. But at some point, even the themes of those sections started to seem repetitive. And there's one more part of this, kind of a weird thing. I was reading through the book slowly on BookTube, making a video for roughly every 100 pages. And during the first few, I was really excited to think very deeply about the pages I was reading. I felt, a sense of pressure to continue to make these in-depth discussions, even though I think what I really needed to do at that point was just read through a bit more quickly without taking the book quite so seriously. At first, I loved going through the work so carefully. By the midpoint, it started feeling like I had the same things to say, and that it was really an unproductive slog for me, which I wasn't sure really made any sense to anyone watching. So I put the book aside, and I'm not planning to pick it up in 2024. 2025? Maybe. Brian at the great channel Bookish asks, do you have a favorite short or short-ish poem, and would you read it for us? I love to read aloud, both stories and poems, so I'm thrilled to get this question. And actually, I think I'll choose something from Emily Dickinson. I recently finished a complete collection of her letters and have just written a review of it for Open Letters Review. The book won't be published until early next week, but my review is now up, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. So, here goes. This is I Dwell in Possibility by Emily Dickinson. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors, the fairest, for occupation, this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. I've always been fascinated by how often Emily Dickinson uses in her poetry the imagery of architecture to talk about her own mind, or about imagination. Here, the house is poetry, with its structure. The walls are strong, and doors are too, keeping people out, perhaps. But there are a lot of windows to look out on the world. And the roof? Well, it's completely open. I especially love the pun of occupation. She's occupying the structure while she's occupied by writing the poem with its own structure. And the word this, she's saying that writing poetry is her occupation, that her occupation is this particular poem. That's what's been keeping her occupied. Or maybe she's talking about the occupation we have, the occupation of reading this poem and trying to understand it. Also, I always choke up every time I read the spreading wide my narrow hands line. Thank you, Brian, for encouraging me to read something out. Heather Gregg has left me a little collection of questions. Okay, let's roll up our sleeves and get started before you're answering the 4.1K questions. That will not be happening, but she goes on. Answer as many of the following questions as you dare. First, she asks, what are a few favorite BookTube tags? I'll do a little follow-up on Brian's question and tell you about a tag Roz at Scallydandling About the Books made, the Springtime Poetry tag. In it, I read several different poems I love, including one of my very favorites called How to Like It by Stephen Dobbin. I'll leave a link down below. Another tag that really sticks out in my memory was created by Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse. The tag was called the Deathbed Tag, I think, and Jason's goal was to get us to think about some of the literature and art that is most deeply important to us. I used it to talk a little bit about David's diagnosis and prognosis for the first time here on BookTube. I knew from the very beginning of my channel that there would come a time when the BookTube community might be really nice to have. I didn't think then that I would ever talk about what was going on. And then when I did, well, I feel like I got to see the incredible kindness and emotional generosity here. And I think that might have been the moment when my acquaintances on BookTube really started to feel like friends. That was an amazing gift that only happened because of Jason's tag, which actually I think he made in concert with Lukas from what used to have the best name ever on BookTube, Totally Pretentious. Heather's second question, were you ever tagged to answer questions on something which you didn't want to, but you slyly twisted the tag to suit you? Yes, I twist questions to my own liking all of the time. If a question doesn't make sense for me personally to answer, I turn it into something I can answer. But there was one tag, a whole tag, that actually threw me for a loop. The men over at Codex Cantina tagged me for the Skyrim tag. I looked up what Skyrim was, and I still didn't quite understand what it was. For those of you who are clueless, I guess it's some sort of video game. Anyway, I used the questions to talk about, well, Shakespeare. I'll leave a link to it in the show notes. Another question from Heather. Favorite knitting challenge? Well, knitting probably takes up less of my time than reading, but it's nevertheless a huge part of my life, except perhaps on the hottest days of summer. Interestingly, I recently had a conversation with a non-knitter about knitting that I find especially challenging. I'm a fairly experienced knitter now, after decades and decades of practice, and I very much enjoy the challenge of lace projects with tiny yarn and lots of openwork patterning. And I really love to knit cables with assorted forms of twisted stitches that give a project a real sense of texture. But what I find challenging to an extreme and don't yet feel comfortable doing is color work. That is, projects with multiple colors happening in each row. Yes, I know there are knitters who love color work but are scared off by cables and or by lace, but I've never been one of them. For those of you who are knitters and want to chat about why, hit me up on Voxer or by email and I'll try to explain. I've succeeded in knitting a 2-color shawl that uses an easier for me kind of color work involving slipped stitches. And I have my eye on a really beautiful colorwork vest for the next time I'm ready for a really big challenge. Wish me luck. Well, one more from Heather. Is it time to poke the bear? Is it time to continue your winning streak on Has Steve Read It? I'm not sure I actually won either round of the great tag where we all tried to come up with a list of 10 generally available books we'd read but thought Steve might not have read. None of us did especially well. I was in the lead for a while in the first season of the tag, and my son was in the lead for a while for the second season of the tag. The reason I pulled ahead was mostly because I had asked if he had read my own book, and he had not. If another season goes around and I actually try again, I might in fact give that same title again, just to see if he's actually read it since then. Well, speaking of Steve Donahue, he asks, is there a kind of book or a kind of reading to which you feel you're more open as a direct result of BookTube? Let me say up front that I really enjoy BookTube events and read-alongs. Still, I'm pretty committed to read only books I actually want to read. I certainly am not going to start reading super popular books I'm not interested in just because everyone else seems to want to read them or hear about them. However, I absolutely do see the kind of change you're asking about, that being open to a wider range of books. BookTube really put me right in front of readers I've come to respect very much, who read really different kinds of books and have really different ways of reading. I still am not reading much, science fiction or fantasy or category romance or whatever, but now I find it absolutely fascinating to hear about even less popular Victorian novels. Although I was totally open to the idea before, I've learned so much about a whole range of Victorian authors I had not read, and therefore I started trying to catch up a bit. All of that learning started pretty much because of the incredible Katie from Books and Things, whose videos were my introduction to BookTube. And you, Steve, have added to the diversity of my reading in two ways. One, by recommending older books I didn't know about, or which no one had ever recommended to me. And also because you introduced me to the world of book reviewing. I now read more very new books than I used to as well. Both other booktubers and some of you fantastic commenters have suggested books specifically to me, not just stuff you liked yourselves, but books that you think might be perfect for my own tastes. I think I had only, let's say less than 10 pre-BookTube book friends at any one time who knew my taste well enough to be able to do that. And now I seem to have hundreds, or if these numbers are actually correct, 4,000 of you. Steve, you ask about being open not only to books, but to different reading as well. And I guess there are a lot of ways to parse that. Here's one. While I have read hardbacks, trade paperbacks, mass markets forever, and ebooks for a very long time now, I very rarely listened to audiobooks. I have some very fond memories of listening to audiobooks in the car when David and I were driving either up to his parents or down to mine. But the idea of listening while I clean house a bit, or while I'm knitting, or at night when I've already turned out the lights, but listen for a bit before going to sleep, to be honest, that just didn't appeal to me before. But hearing so many great readers, people who think deeply about what they read, say how much they love listening to audiobooks made me give it a few more tries, and I've become quite enamored. I'm quite aware, though, that I'm far less able to think critically when I just hear the words rather than see them. I also don't have much of an auditory memory either. So if you see me give a really lame discussion of something on here, you can probably assume that it's because I listened to the audiobook. Also, I tend to enjoy nonfiction, especially essays, actually, on audio a lot more than fiction. And I'm not quite sure why it seems to be such a different kettle of fish for me. But whatever the reason, the idea that audiobooks are a relatively frequent part of my life now is solely thanks to BookTube. Well, I think that will do it for today's video. Part 2 of this 4K Q&A will be coming up next weekend, I hope. Thank you for all the great questions, and thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.